All right, so we got the basics behind plants. We know what a plant is. We know its properties. We know it's got chloroplasts in it. We know a little bit about its growth. Now we're going to talk more about the reproductive aspects. And we're going to talk about seeds, pollen grains, flowers, fruits, and most importantly for this, the alternation of generations. I absolutely 100% guarantee you that there will be an essay on your next exam about alternation of generations. It is that important. It's what allowed plants to not just colonize land, but really expand outward. All of plant reproduction is based on the fact that plants came from the sea and they are still bound by it. It's dry on land, and you need to account for that. To really thrive, plants had to go in alternation of generations. What this allowed them to do is to very quickly and very efficiently produce a ton of new plants. So you start off with the zygote, 2N. You guys understand that part. An egg and a sperm come together, so N gamete plus N gamete equals 2N zygote. That starts to develop in the seed as an embryo, a little baby plant. That embryo grows up into what's known as a sporophyte. That is its 2N stage. The sporophyte creates a structure known as the sporangia, which produces spore mother cells. All right, so we've gone from 2N diploid plant to producing a sporangia that makes these big freaking the spores. Those spores then undergo meiosis. Now in meiosis, you have the number of chromosomes. So now we've got N spores. That seems fairly much like your body works so far. You start with your 2N, you undergo meiosis, and you produce haploid sex cells. But plants don't produce haploid sex cells. They produce haploid spores. Those spores land, and they grow into what's known as a gametophyte. The gametophyte is a multicellular haploid structure. Every single one of the cells in the gametophyte are genetically identical to those haploid spores. As they've undergone many, many rounds of mitosis, you've produced identical haploid cells that are eggs and sperm. So instead of producing one egg and one egg that's N and that's it, or I'm sorry, 4 eggs or 4 sperm, you're producing many, many millions of them that are just identical to each other. Okay, so to put it as different terms, it's going to be a weird image, so please bear with me. You, 2N organism. You grow up, you sexually mature, you produce your gametes. Those gametes somehow leave your body and land on the ground. That then grows up into an entirely different organism that is genetically identical to your gametes, that produces gametes just like yours. And it can go and do the whole reproductive job now. You don't need to worry about it. You've got this little clone thing that's got half your chromosomes in it going out and fertilizing stuff. In this way, plants are able to produce massive amounts of baby plants. That's the alternation of generations. Those egg and sperm fuse, you're back to your zygote and back around. You have a diploid stage and a haploid stage. Questions? This was essential to early plants. If they alternated their generations, they had a reproductive advantage. They could produce a lot of offspring very, very cheaply. It did not expend a lot of energy. For you guys, for us, reproduction is super expensive. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of food to get through it. Plants don't have that issue. Where we produce 1 or 2 offspring, they're going to produce millions. So instead of making 4 gametes in an energy, very expensive process of meiosis, you're going to have that same gamete undergo many rounds of mitosis to increase the number of gametes super cheaply. It also let plants develop very specific structures. In moss, usually you see moss as this sort of flat greenish thing on the ground. But moss will also send up these structures, these sporangia, coming up. Now, they're going to go up high before they drop spores. Why do they go up high before they drop spores? Yeah, get caught in the wind, spread them farther. You don't want your spore to land right next to you. Take your stuff. It's like, you know, you kind of, as much as people are like, I would love my kids to live with me forever, you might also be thinking, if they leave, I don't have to pay for them anymore. What's going through your parents' minds? They're like, I'm going on a cruise. So these structures do look very different. Typically, the sporophyte is higher than the gametophyte. The gametophyte is going to be a lower structure. And the reason the sporophyte's typically higher is so it can release those spores into the wind. This structure is actually moss. Moss doesn't have true roots. Moss is really interesting. It's called a bryophyte. We're going to get into them in a bit of detail. So any questions on alternation of generations? So here's the gametophyte of the moss. They are going to produce the haploid gametes. Those gametes are going to come together and fuse in order to make the zygote. They are genetically identical gametes. That's hugely different from animals that make genetically distinct gametes. The structure that produces gametes is called the gametangia. That's the broad term. And there are, of course, male and female gametangia. There are archegonia and the antheridia. As you can see up here, this image is the archegonium. The eggs are held underneath. That's compared to the antheridium, where the sperm is going to be on top. In your opinion, with the archegonium, there we go. With the archegonium, why is it that the eggs are underneath this big cap? What? To protect them from what? You're right, protection. But what from what? What would be super damaging to any sort of gamete? What's shining down on the top of this? The sun. And what's the sun have a lot of? Radiation. And just like you want to protect your gametes from radiation, they want to protect their gametes from radiation. So they've got these very thick casings over them, and they're protected by typically a shield of other cells. As far as the sperm go, it looks like they're being produced from the top because they are, but this structure typically goes up and leans over. So there's a lot of sperm up here, and it's like a bell that goes back and forth, just dropping sperm everywhere. In order to make a zygote, you've got to get the sperm to the egg. And this is going to be common not just among these early plants, but among modern and sophisticated plants. You've got the archegonium has a long tube to it. The egg is at the bottom of the tube. The sperm has to start at the top of the tube and work its way down in order to fertilize the egg. It has to be moist in order to do this. Without water, this sperm cannot move through the plant. It's why gardens don't do well during when it's very dry. Because in order for a plant to be fertilized, it needs to have moisture in that tube. The reason for that is because you have to remember the sperm is flagellated. It swims. To swim, you need something to swim through, so it swims through water. The sperm swims down to the egg, fertilizes it, you get a zygote. The zygote develops into the embryo. The embryo becomes the sporophyte. Questions so far? That diploid zygote's going to stay inside of gametophytic tissue. So you've got a diploid on the inside developing. The outside, the seed coat, is all haploid still. All of our land plants, all the plants you run across outside on your way in, are termed embryophytes because they all produce embryos. Doesn't mean they're all seeded, but they all produce embryos. And those embryos depend on maternal development. Just like you guys depended on maternal development when you were in utero, now these plants are depending on their mother. Every seed out there is going to have a few different components to it. One, it's got the embryo itself, and you've also got the sort of very fat-rich section known as the cotyledon. That cotyledon is where the offspring is drawing energy from until it can eventually get its leaves out and start to take energy from the sun. They all display what's known as matritrophy. In fact, you display matritrophy. Would you guys remember what trophy means? Like heterotroph, autotroph? No? What? Eat, yeah, food. So in this case, you're eating your mom. Well, it's okay. We did too. It's when you're, in fact, babies and zygotes are little parasites that just suck off all the nutrients from the mom. In this case, the mom had to do double the work because she's eating not just for herself, but for the offspring in order to provide it with food. So it's feeding from the mother. So those cells within the sporophyte start to undergo meiosis. You got a spore mother produced, that spore mother undergoes meiosis, you produce those genetically varied haploid cells. The haploid cells will then be released by structures on the sporophyte. And those structures can look very different. They're all adapted to spreading these spores very far and wide. Most of them are very thick-walled. The reason for the thick wall is to protect from ultraviolet radiation, protect the developing spores. And then they've got some dispersal mechanism, like this one. Here you can see sort of little fingers, almost like the gills of a mushroom. And what that allows to happen is individual spores come out. Instead of clumping, they're evenly dispersed. It's like if you took a spray bottle and sprayed it, you've got a filter on the end that expands the water outward instead of having it all clumped together as a one shot. You might have bells. Each of these bells is a very wide bottom to it, so that when it starts to shake, and it does shake in the wind, it's going to send some spores that way, and then some spores that way, and some spores that way, back and forth. So to put all of this together, all of these ideas of alternation of generations, I want to talk about moss, which is a true plant, now that we've discovered. Mosses grow pretty much anywhere you got moisture. They're called bryophytes. They're low structures to the ground. They're limited in their size. They cannot grow to be big, lush bushes. Typically, they're found in cool, moist environments. Here you can see them growing in between cobblestones. Anywhere where you've got water sitting, they can be. Typically, the structure you see is the gametophyte, the low, flat structure. It's only rarely, certain times a year, do you see the sporophyte structure. The sporophyte structure you'll sometimes notice growing high above the rest of the mosses. So these moss can't grow tall because they have what's called determinate growth. They lack the ability to pull nutrients up from the ground. They have rootlets to hold them in place, but those roots don't actually do any absorbing of water. Instead, all of the water gets absorbed through osmosis. That means that if there's lots and lots of cells on the outside, they absorb the water first, and that doesn't get all the way into the cells in the middle. So cannot grow big, because if you're like a tree, like a giant tree, it's really hard to get the water to diffuse into the center of the tree. Instead, you've got a much smaller, thinner structure that allows water to be taken up very quickly and easily. The downside is it's also very responsive then to drought. If a drought happens, even for a short amount of time, all the moss dies. So down here, you can see these, well, maybe, these little tiny rootlets. Those are not there for pulling in water. And even if they were, they don't extend anywhere into the ground, which means you don't have any reliable mechanism of getting water. They are completely and totally reliant on osmosis. Further, they have no hardwood tissue. They don't have any strong tissues true tissues that will give them structure. A lot of plants have tissues known as vascular tissues that are going to give them almost a skeleton in the center. But these guys don't have that. Imagine if you didn't have your skeleton. What would your body look like? Pretty much, it'd be a blob on the ground. And you wouldn't be as tall as you are, that's for sure. Right, just like those fish in high pressure. They lose their shape. You could think of mosses then almost like a stack of water balloons. Have you ever made a bucket full of water balloons? What happens to the water balloons on the bottom of the bucket? Yeah, they either get really squished down or they pop. There's only so high you can stack water balloons before the weight crushes the ones on the bottom. Likewise with mosses, there's only so high you can go with a cell before it squishes down the cells underneath it without that stabilizing tissue. So they're simple organisms. They're simple plants. They help us understand alternation of generations really well. But in the end, they can't grow really tall. They can't expand out broadly. There was a time in the Earth's history where mosses dominated the land. Can you imagine that? It was just, not kidding, you could just imagine this if you will. Mosses everywhere except for these giant 25-foot tall fungi. So moss, huge phallic-looking structure sticking out of the ground. Moss. Pretty cool. Because those mosses had better tissues. I'm sorry, the fungus had better tissues.